thank you for joining us. It looks like some people are still signing on right now, but we're going to get started in just a second. Okay. Welcome to our webinar. There are a lot of people who signed up for this today, so we're not going to turn on the microphones, but please use the question box to talk to us for the question and answer session at the end. Just so you know, our presentation will take just a little over half an hour, and then we'll stay on the line as long as there are questions. We've included this PowerPoint as one of the attachments to this webinar for anyone who would rather follow along that way. We're also going to post this PowerPoint on the grants webpage along with a recording of this session after it's over. This is who we are.
I'm Chris Perry, and I manage the Public Education Unit for the California Coastal Commission.
And I'm Sylvie Lee, and I coordinate our grants program. We've listed our phone numbers here because we encourage people to call us to discuss your project before you write a proposal, so we can talk to you one-on-one about your ideas. We're going to start with a couple of quick polls so we can find out a little bit about you. We've tailored this session for less experienced applicants, but we're interested to know if you've done one of these applications before or if you happen to be on last year's webinar. So if you could take a second to tell us your level of experience, that will be helpful. And we will have this up in just 1 second. And this is asking how many grant applications you've done before. Many of you, none. And some of you, a little. And so it looks like we're going to go ahead and close that poll and look at the results. And most of you have not done this before, so we're glad we can help you out. And about a quarter of you have done a couple, and a small percentage of you are experts. So that's great to know that. Thank you. And then now we're going to launch the next poll real quick here, which is, did you participate in last year's webinar? If you could just tell us that really fast. And it looks like most of you didn't, which is great to know. And we're going to end this in just a second. So most of you are new to this, so that's great. For the few of you who were on last year's webinar, just so you know, you're going to recognize a lot of the slides and what we're saying, just to be aware of that, but there is some new content that we're going to go over. Okay, so now I'm going to move on. Thank you all for helping us out.
Okay, so we're going to begin by talking about the types of projects and project activities that have been funded by this grant. Keep in mind that these are examples and not an exhaustive list. We've funded almost 700 projects, and there really is no typical project. But we'll describe some of the more common types. And after that, we'll walk you through the selection criteria and the application process. You're going to see a lot of words on the screen because we've excerpted sections of the guidelines and the application form. You won't need to read every word, but this will help tie what we're talking about to what you'll see in the guidelines and application. And then we'll end with a question and answer session. So as Sylvie said, type your questions into the question box as they occur to you, and we'll address them at the end.
This is the cover sheet of our application packet, and we've put the purpose of these funds right on the cover page. And it says that these funds support programs that teach California's children and the general public to value and take action to improve the health of the state's marine and coastal environments. So what can that look like? We fund a lot of different kinds of projects targeting either the general public or targeting youth, including hands-on marine science lessons and activities, and a lot of experiential learning in the field. This doesn't have to be on the coast, although often it is, but it could be at a creek or in a science center or elsewhere. We fund quite a bit of bus transportation because, as we probably don't have to tell most of you, there's a big need for bus money, and this is usually funded as part of a larger educational program. We can also fund educational programs that take place from boats. We can fund Tidepool studies, and we funded some interesting citizen science projects. And we don't have to fund field trips at all. We funded plenty of projects that take place right at school or in a museum. We've also funded the occasional video and sometimes professional development for teachers. There's also a subcategory of grants for climate change education, which funds projects dealing with topics like sea level rise, ocean acidification, or other things having to do with climate change in the coastal and ocean environments.
Continuing with examples of what we fund, this grants program has a big emphasis on environmental stewardship, meaning taking action to help care for the coast and other environmental resources. For example, a project might involve participants in native habitat restoration,
here's another example, pollution prevention messaging through storm drain art.
In this example, signs to protect snowy plovers on this beach in San Diego were designed by school kids. And another example of stewardship is the shoreline cleanup. Ideally, we like to see that the stewardship aspect is well integrated with any educational aspect, so there's context that gives the stewardship activity meaning to participants. And mentioning shoreline cleanups brings me to our newly renamed funding category, Shoreline Cleanup and Enhancement. This used to be called the Adopt a Beach funding category and was just for Adopt a Beach managers or Coastal Cleanup Day coordinators. But starting this year, we've made it broader and more accessible, so Adopt a Beach managers that want to add an educational component to their cleanups can still apply, but we're also trying to encourage other types of shoreline improvement projects that involve the public, like dune restoration or river cleanups, or wetland restoration, or other shoreline enhancement projects like that. Our other two broad categories are youth education programs and educational programs for the general public.
People often ask if their project has to be on the coast. It does not have to be on the coast. We funded projects in Santa Ana and San Bernardino and Redding and Chico and plenty of other inland places. But it should still include education about the coast and ocean and how you are connected with that coast and ocean environment wherever you may be. So for example, if you're teaching about watersheds and where people may be in their watershed, include the downstream end too, so you can cover the whole length of it. Or if you're doing a project on an inland waterway, there's content you could incorporate like tides or salinity or estuaries if those are relevant to where you are. It's also common for inland projects to include education about migrating species like salmon. An example of a stewardship message for an inland project would be incorporating how actions taking place inland affect the coast and ocean. Moving on from what this program funds, we're going to talk a little about who we're trying to reach. Sometimes projects reach large numbers of people in the general public, and that's one of our funding categories. Otherwise, we're trying to reach people, both youth and adults, who are underserved in terms of accessing marine education and coastal opportunities. So who are the people who don't often have access to marine education and stewardship programs? They could be low-income populations, multicultural or English language learning communities, or people in inner city or inland or rural areas too. Starting this year, we are no longer saying that we can't fund a project if it has a limited targeted audience. So if you have a project in mind that focuses on only a certain type of user group, like just girls or just Spanish speakers, Please do consult with us first so we can explain how to set it up to avoid any potential issues.
Also new this year is a new funding subcategory for smaller, more grassroots organizations with annual operating budgets of $500,000 or less that are working with underserved communities. There's no specific amount of money set aside for this, but the Coastal Commission is implementing it as a way to help level the playing field a bit for organizations that may not have a large capacity or dedicated fundraising staff. Our agency would like to try to support more grassroots groups that turn in proposals for very, very good projects, but don't quite have the capacity of some larger organizations that they're competing with.
And now we're going to walk you through our scoring system. These criteria are directly from the guidelines. The first criteria is the project's educational impact or environmental improvement. These grants are really for educating about the marine and coastal environments as well as for improving those habitats. The stronger the educational experience will be, the more points your proposal will receive.
One way to think about educational impact is, what are the participants going to learn and experience? And what do you hope they will come away from the project with? In other words, we're using the term education broadly to encompass knowledge, but also experiences and the cultivation of a stewardship ethic.
The second criteria is need. The more need you demonstrate for your project, the more points you'll get. The need could be people needing something they don't already have access to, or an environmental problem that needs addressing, or it could be both. This criteria is about the why of your project, where you can walk us through why this project is important and needed. The third criteria is project concept, which is essentially about your idea and your design. The elements listed here are ones we believe would contribute to an impactful project design. Bear in mind that they are not requirements, but guideposts. To elaborate on these, the way we're thinking about culturally competent approaches has to do with considering your audience and having staff with understanding and skills to effectively engage with people from your audience's culture or cultures. It's also about having programming that is culturally relevant for your audience. And we're encouraging projects to reflect research-based best practices. These are strategies that have been field tested and found to increase positive outcomes such as increased knowledge and awareness, positive attitudes towards the environment, critical thinking skills, stewardship intentions and behavior, and enjoyment. Examples include focusing on real-world problems that are relevant to the audience, providing longer and/or repeated experiences that include preparation and opportunities for reflection, and fostering a sense of ownership and empowerment as part of the program. We recognize that since we fund a wide range of types of projects, these practices will not apply to all of them, but it's something to consider, so we encourage you to take a look to see if they could apply. And to help with that, there's a link in the guidelines to a document that summarizes some of what's been discovered with regard to research-based best practices and lists resources. There is a lot more research out there, but this is a place to start. And this next slide, which is also part of project concept, but is for extra credit, speaks to how a project would have benefits beyond the organization and its programs to assist other organizations, help the field, or build meaningful collaborations. And quick comment, this actually is required, and the next slide will be about extra credit. What? Sorry, made a mistake. We will also take into consideration the potential the project has for continuing after the grant ends and/or its potential for building organizational capacity. And the last thing listed here is the project's degree of impact relative to cost, or as we sometimes refer to it, the bang for the buck. Sorry about that. Okay, got those reversed. Yeah. Okay, this part is for extra credit. Okay, and now we're going to go to Finally, the fourth criteria is proposal content and project implementation. We're looking for well-developed ideas where you've already figured out a lot of the details and a good evaluation plan and a good budget.
One way to think about this criteria is to look at your proposal from the point of view of the reader. How well does the write-up paint a thorough and vivid picture of what you want to do? Are there some areas that are vague and could leave the reader with questions? You may want to have someone unfamiliar with the project read through it and see if it makes sense to them.
And continuing on this section, it also covers how likely it seems that the project will succeed and turn out well, and whether all the needed pieces are in place. So, when you're putting together your application, the first thing that goes on top is a summary form. I'm not going to go through every line, but we did want to highlight some of them. The applicant organization is the organization name you would want written on a check if you were to get a grant. If you have a fiscal sponsor, you can write the fiscal sponsor's name and a slash and then the project name. The contact person is to list is whoever wants to be notified whether or not the proposal will be funded. Sometimes people call me and they wonder why they didn't hear from us, and it turns out it's because they didn't list themselves as a contact person. For the project title, you can make up whatever name you want, but you don't have to repeat the name of the organization in the project title. Also, we give our commissioners a report of every grant application that comes in, and in the format of this report, there is room for about 7 words for the title, so just keep in mind if your title is longer than about 7 words, we may end up shortening it for you. The brief project summary is an important part of this cover sheet, and it doesn't include the why or the how, but really just the what and maybe the who. So we've included a few real-life examples for you. This one is very short. It's just one sentence, which is shorter than most, but it does the job, and it was funded. And I'll give you a moment to read through this. This one is only 1 or 2 sentences and just very succinctly sums up the essence. Okay. And this one's a little bit longer with some more details, but it fit in the space and summarizes what will happen during the project. You can look at that. If you find that your cover sheet is going longer than 1 page, then you really ought to go back and do a little bit more summarizing so it all fits. Okay, for question number 8, the number of people to be served, we've changed this a little bit this year because it's useful for us to see both the core number of people served by your project as well as the number of people who are less directly involved. You can leave the second line blank if it doesn't apply to your project. For the requested amount, keep in mind that there are 2 funding levels for this grant. The small grants are $12,000 or less, and the large grants are from $12,000 to $50,000. Small grants won't be that helpful for every project, but if you decide your project can afford to ask for $12,000 or less, that may increase your chances somewhat because we have to fund a minimum of 25% of the budget on the smaller grants. So the bar usually doesn't end up being quite as high in that category, and it's usually a little bit easier to get a small grant. On the other hand, if you want to ask for a larger grant, and a lot of people do, also keep in mind that even though we say the maximum is $50,000, in reality, $50,000 grants are actually pretty rare. So just remember, if you're going to ask for a pretty large grant, like in the $40,000 to $50,000 range, the bar will be higher the more you ask for. So be prepared to make a very strong case for the project. And the last point about this cover sheet is we don't care who signs it, so whoever really wrote it is welcome to take pride and put your name down. It doesn't necessarily have to be the executive director or someone like that. Okay.
Then after the cover sheet comes the body of your proposal. You'll start by writing a little bit of background. Focus on how your idea of the project got to this stage. Have you gotten funding for it before? If it's an ongoing project, this is a place to talk about past results. Don't worry about discussing everything you want to do next. All that should come later.
Next comes the biggest part of the proposal, which is the project description. It's in 6 sections. The first section doesn't have to be long. It's the goals and objectives, which are a summary of what you hope to accomplish without all the details yet. At the end of the project, you'll be assessing how well the objectives were met.
Taken together, the objectives should achieve the goals. Ideally, the objectives are measurable indicators of success.
Here are a few real-life examples of what a list of goals and objectives can look like. This project listed several goals, and you can take a second to look that over. And these were followed by a few measurable objectives that specifically list how the overarching goals will be met. You could take a second or two to look that over. Okay. Here's another example. This one also lists very specific measurable objectives that will accomplish a short list of goals. So as you can see, it's quite concise and specific. And here's maybe the most textbook way of doing this, where each goal has its own corresponding objectives listed out.
How you format the goals and objectives will depend on what makes most sense for your project. For example, a format like this may not work well for a project in which some of the objectives serve more than one goal. The main point here is to go for clarity and precision in laying out your goals and objectives, which will keep the project on track and will simplify the evaluation process.
The next section of the project description, section B, is all about who you're going to serve, how you're going to reach them, and why you want to work with them. The more you can say about the target community and the planning you've put into reaching them, the better.
The third section of the project description, section C, is the project details. This is really the heart of your whole proposal. It should be where you elaborate on your objectives and put the longest, most detailed description of what you want to do and how you're going to do it. This is also where you can put details about educational content and describe what participants will be learning and doing. Here is a list of some points to consider in your write-up. These are listed in the guidelines too. We're interested in understanding how intensive your program is going to be in terms of days and hours or hours of programming. If you have a curriculum, we'd like to see it, or you can include a link to it. We want to know about products such as new program materials you'll create, who are the partners you're going to be working with, and what plans do you have for outreach and publicity about your project. We want to hear about project design considerations as they apply to your project, like cultural relevancy, age appropriateness, inclusivity, and research-based best practices. We'd like to know if this is a one-time project or one that is ongoing and will continue beyond the grant period. If you're submitting a proposal for a project that previously received a Whaletail grant, you should include a summary of what was accomplished with the prior grant and how this new proposal builds on that. So that's all part of Section C, the project details. Section D of the project description is for information about key staff. This is your chance to talk about who will be carrying out the project, their roles, their relevant qualifications and experience, and why they will make the project great.
And Section E of the project description is the statement of need for the project. This is the section where I usually say, I wish I had a nickel every time someone mentioned Richard Louv. And don't get me wrong, it's totally fine to mention Richard Louv and nature deficit disorder. But my point is that if possible, we'd like you to get more specific and also talk about why this particular project is important and what need it's filling. Your project will stand out to the extent you can describe how your project is designed to meet a need of your particular audience or your particular community or the particular environment you want to work in.
We have a few examples for you of statements of need that get down to the more particulars. And these are excerpts from much longer descriptions from projects funded by Whaletail grants. This project by Ventana Wilderness Society in Big Sur includes visitor education as well as cleanups of microtrash at highway pullouts. The statement of need you see here relates the project to the California condor preservation. Ingestion of microtrash by condor nestlings has been found to be one of the main limiting factors in condor population growth in the wild. This quote is from the application for the Audubon project we highlighted earlier that involved student-designed signs to educate the public about least tern nesting in San Diego. The problem is pretty specific, and the intervention was tested through a pilot program and recommended by Wildlife Agency staff. And I'll just pause for a moment for you to look at this.
A project by Outdoor Outreach in San Diego served teens from low-income, park-poor communities who faced multiple barriers to the outdoors. The application described these barriers, which are transportation, safety, lack of green spaces, and made the connection between getting students outside and the future of the coast. A healthy and inclusive California coastline in the future is dependent on engaging diverse youth in coastal conservation. So these are some examples of identified needs that drove projects. However, we recognize that there are important broad societal needs that drive projects, and you may not have anything more specific than that, and that's perfectly okay too. Okay, and finally, the last section of the project description is section F. Whereas the prior set of slides talk about the need for the project, this slide goes to a different kind of need, the need for this funding in order to make the project happen. Here's also where you can describe any longer-term funding plan for the project. To the extent the project is intended to continue beyond the term of the grant, what happens when this funding is spent. And that's the end of the 3 to 6 page project description.
Now let's go over the evaluation plan. Although as you can see in our application, the evaluation plan is a separate section from the project description, in reality they should go hand in hand, with the evaluation being planned alongside the project. Many of our grantees plan and conduct their evaluations in-house, and some hire consultants. Either is fine, and your choice will depend mainly on budget considerations and your in-house capabilities. We are advising that you consider allocating between 5 and 15% of a project budget to evaluation as a rough guideline. This is a pretty broad range because, again, we're looking for what makes most sense for your particular situation. A modest project that uses a proven model might warrant a more basic evaluation effort than, say, for example, a project with very ambitious goals that is looking to scale up. This slide shows the rest of the evaluation plan instructions from the grant application. These instructions say to consider what methods or combination of methods would be most appropriate for learning about your project. A lot of environmental education programs rely primarily on a pre-post survey and metrics for evaluation. And that is all well and good. There are good reasons for that, and that may be all that's needed. However, other methods, such as interviews with participants, can also provide valuable insights. So we're just suggesting that you consider the range of options because they have different strengths. Surveys help describe program results over a range of participants and can document changes over time. And interviews and other qualitative methods can help fill in the story behind the numbers and provide the kind of understanding that guides program improvement. There's a lot to say on this topic, but I will stop there and just point out the last thing on this slide, which is a link to an online evaluation guide that might be helpful in navigating this process.
Most projects won't require a permit, but in case yours does, then here's the place to list them. Number 5, the most common one we see is probably a collection permit if you want to have a touch tank, for example, or you can mention if you have permission from a landowner to do restoration on the property. But the permit section probably won't apply to most of your projects. The next part of the application is the task list and timeline, which is evidence of a solid, well thought out plan. Keep in mind that the earliest a timeline can start is March 2019 after the funding becomes available, and some tasks will need to start by June 2019, which is the end of the fiscal year. Sometimes people wonder how long a grant should last. That's really up to you. If you have a very finite project that will be done by the end of the summer, then your timeline will just be a few months. Often the timeline is a year or until the end of the next school year, or even 2 years. The latest your project could end, if you need this long, is April of 2021. It's up to you what you want the task list and timeline to look like. It could be a simple bullet list like this, or a table like this, or even a more complicated chart if that's what helps you get organized. Okay, and next we come to the budget. I think of a budget and the narrative that goes with it as like a snapshot. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, you've now written your 1,000 words, and here's the picture that goes along with it. These numbers, combined with the budget details, should give a good overview of what exactly you're proposing. So here we have 2 columns, and the first column is for listing all the funding you're requesting. And if the project budget is larger than the request, then you'll use the second column to list all the project expenses. This is a good time to remind everyone that these grants are paid by reimbursement only, so keep in mind that for everything that you list in the grant request column, you're going to need to invoice us after you've paid the cost up front or received a bill. This is also a good time to remind people about things that we aren't allowed to fund. This money can't pay for food, insurance, buying or making items that you're going to sell, or private gifts like raffle prizes or gift cards. So for costs like food or insurance, you won't want to list those in the grant request column. And these are the footnotes on the same page. They say things like, number 2 explains the maximum percentage for benefits, although often it'll be lower for a lot of organizations. Number 4 is about how auto travel reimbursement is always based on the IRS reimbursement rate. And for number 5, you can request some funds for indirect costs, which are also sometimes called overhead. These have to do with the cost of doing business for your organization and are separate from the other direct expenses that are specifically for carrying out the proposed project. To figure out the most you can request for overhead, look at the amount you're requesting for total personnel, and then take 10% of that number, and that's the maximum we can pay for indirect costs. I skipped over footnote number 1 and footnote number 3 just now because starting this year, they get their own worksheet, which is a budget narrative. And this really isn't more work than it used to be. It's just that people weren't always noticing that they should do this when it was listed in tiny little footnotes. So we're trying to make them harder to miss. You don't have to use this form, but do include something that shows how you arrived at the math for the amount you're asking for personnel. So here's where you need to list the different positions that would be funded by this grant and how much they would be paid. As a general rule, by the way, grantee employee salaries shouldn't be higher than equivalent state employee salaries, so those rates will be reviewed for reasonableness. If you listed grant funding for supplies and materials, please remember to list the major items here so it's clear what you're requesting money for.
Next is a resolution or letter from someone with authority from your organization. People aren't always sure what this should look like. Public agencies often require a formal resolution. For other organizations, it depends on your organization's protocol For some, it is a letter from a board chair or a treasurer. And for a lot of you, the letter could be from an executive director or a finance director or someone like that who's authorized to sign contracts and submit grant proposals. We've included a link in the application where you can see samples of the different types of documents that you could use, and they're also included as an attachment to this webinar. Next comes basic background information on your organization. A lot of it may be content that you already have prepared that you can insert, like a board list or your annual budget. We require an annual budget for everyone except public agencies and schools. The annual budget is critical if you want to be included in the new category of funding for smaller organizations with budgets of $500,000 or less.
And finally, come the attachments. If you're a nonprofit organization, include proof of your nonprofit status. Please include a site list or map of where you would be working. If you have any brochures you want to include, those are great to see. And any other supporting materials are optional. For example, letters of support are helpful if they come from project partners, like if you want to go into a neighboring elementary school, you can get a letter from them. It's not required, but it's helpful to know if they're already on board. And that's it. Don't forget the postmark deadline of Monday, November 5th. Yes, we are old school. Yes, you really do need to mail 2 hard copies. And yes, we really do mean it when we list the deadline. But keep in mind it's only a postmark deadline, so you really don't have to spend extra money to express mail it to arrive on Monday or anything like that. We're just going to look at the date stamped on the envelope, so that's the only thing you need to worry about.
Okay, and here's the timeline for what happens next. Sylvie mentioned our postmark deadline, November 5th. Then the review process happens through early January, and we'll have funding recommendations by early February, at which point we'll notify applicants. The Coastal Commission will vote on final funding decisions at its meeting in February, and grant agreements will be completed between March and June 2019.
And now there's time to ask questions. Call us later to talk about your individual cases, but you can go ahead and use the question box if you want to ask about something in our presentation, or if you had another question about something we haven't covered. We're going to go ahead and take a look at your questions, which there are a bunch. Can you explain the extra credit?
No.
Yes. And sorry, we got that a little mixed up, but the extra credit is if, one second, I'm going to go to the text to look at it, so we say it right. Yeah, okay, it is up to 5 points of extra credit will be awarded if the project will have a ripple effect beyond the project itself. So it's not just within the project, but if you go beyond that by providing useful tools or knowledge to others in the field, helping to advance the field into new areas, or building fruitful collaborations with other entities. So if you have a ripple effect beyond your project itself, that's how you get extra credit. What is the website for research-based best practices? There's actually an attachment to this webinar right now that you can look at that document, or it's the regular grant website where you get to the grant application. That website also has a link to a document for research-based best practices. Could you repeat the last day to use funding? You can use funding through April of 2021. Would payroll tax be included under salaries and wages? Payroll tax is included under benefits, actually. The benefits are the payroll tax and the health benefits. Okay, the next question is, Should all positions be considered even if they go over the requested amount? I am trying to understand that question. Maybe it means, would all positions be considered even if they go over the requested amount? We can only consider up to $50,000. We could fund part of a position for sure. Usually we just fund part of people's position, even if they are paid more than what we pay. So please feel free to call one of us if we're not answering your question correctly. That was my best attempt. Also, would workers' comp be under benefits? Yes. Do you want to do the next one? For the annual budget, should we include the income statement for 2017, or do we need 2018, 2019 projections? Oh.
I think it's fine to do 2017 if you don't have anything more recent.
I would say the most recent that you have available would be great to see. Could you review how much of the budgets could go towards salaries? I am confused about hourly rates. As much of the budget as you want can go to salaries. It just really depends what you want to ask for. Often it's a combination of salaries and supplies and maybe transportation. If all you really need is money for salaries, that's fine. So that's totally up to you. The hourly rates are just to show us the math for the salaries that you're requesting. So I hope that's clear, and if not, please just give us a call later. If you are notified that your project is funded, could the board decide not to fund your project fully? You will be notified that your project is recommended for funding. That's actually a good question. We didn't talk about that. And then you'll be notified again when it was approved. So most of the time it goes fine, but you're right. You'll be notified in the end of January, very beginning of February, that it's recommended for funding, and then you get a second letter that says, congratulations, our commissioners approved your funding. Do I understand correctly that the grant period can be 2 years, June 2019 to 2021? Yeah, it's about 2 years. The longest it would be spring to 2019 to spring to 2021. So it could start in March or April or May or June of 2019, and then the latest it can end is April of 2021. Do I do the next one? Is there specific funding dedicated to the climate change subcategory?
There is not. That's just, it's a subcategory to indicate that we're trying to encourage applications in that area, but we don't have a specific funding amount set aside for it.
If we are applying as a fiscally sponsored project, should our listed budget be for the fiscal sponsor or for the project? Just for your project, that's what we would like to see. Can you apply for more than one item in a proposal, e.g. pursue funding for a climate change curriculum with student-age participants, as well as fund scholarships for participation? Sure. If it's the same program or project, then sure. Yeah. You could ask for what you need for that project or program. The application mentions that projects within San Francisco Bay must include an explanation of the connection between the bay and coastal ecosystem and its relationship to the project. What might this look like, and how important is this connection to the project?
The question of what it might look like is very dependent on the project itself and what kind of a project you're talking about. We don't want it to be kind of an add-on. We want it to be integrated into the whatever the project is. So if it's a curriculum or if it's some kind of field trip where there's education happening in the field, we would just want that connection to be made through the educational process in some way or another. And ideally, it's part of the whole message of the project that something along the lines of how the bay fits into the watershed and how the watershed connects to the ocean.
Mm-hmm. If a program is hands-on on the water education for public school students, is the best idea to apply to educational grants or the other grants I should apply to with the whale tail grant?
So I think what this question is getting at are the different categories, and the categories are really just some guidance as to the types of projects that we fund. You don't have to apply to a specific category. You just need to submit your proposal, and we need to see that it fits within the realm of the kinds of projects that are appropriate for this grant. So you can talk to us, call us. We do encourage people to call us and talk to us about their projects, and if there's any question, we can go over it then. But I wouldn't be too concerned about the categories.
We don't have employees. Can I include amounts for independent contractors hired to perform work for the project? Yes, we can pay for independent contractors. Will digital version of the presentation be sent to us attendees? It will be posted on the grants website, and it's actually attached to this webinar already. But the recording and the PowerPoint will also be on the grants website where you can go look for it. The timeline indicates contracts are awarded in March to June 2019. If we have a project that happens at the end of April 2019, is that too tight of a timeline to fit within this funding period? So I guess the way I would answer that is to say that technically we could fund it because we can start a contract in March. What you might want to think about is if you're not going to know till the beginning of February, would you want to wait that long to find out if your project's a go? But if you're fine with waiting till the end of January, beginning of February to find out, then we're okay with paying for it. Is there a minimum number of students or general public that the program or project must reach?
No.
No, there isn't.
No.
Who recommends for funding, Sylvie and Chris, or the board? Who decides what?
We have a process set up within the Coastal Commission, and Sylvie and I are both involved in that process, as are other staff people, and together we make a recommendation to the Coastal Commission.
With our management.
With our management, yes.
Are there projects that are recommended and then don't get approved? It is always a possibility, but it's...
I don't know if... I can't recall that it's ever happened.
I can't recall that's ever happened either.
Theoretically.
Okay, here's an interesting question. Are projects sometimes approved but at a lower level than the request? So partial funding.
Yes, this does come up. Part of our mandate is to be able to spread the money around geographically as much as we can, and what ends up happening with that is we sometimes will award or we will always check with the applicant first to see whether or not it's viable for them to get a smaller amount than was requested, but that does come up from time to time.
Okay, someone asked, can one organization apply for funding for more than one project? And someone else asked, can I submit more than one application for different projects?
Yes.
Yes, you can, although I would say the odds of having them both funded are probably quite small. So if you know you like one better than the other, then you might want to prioritize that one. How many applicants do you receive on average each year, and how many are awarded a grant? We usually get a little over 100. There's this funny number of 110 that is very often 110 or close to it, but sometimes it's been much more and sometimes it's been a bit less. And we usually award 20-something grants. Should email to schedule a call with either of you, and can we review past applications to see where they can be improved? You can email to schedule a call, but honestly, you can also just pick up the phone, and I'm usually there. And I would be happy to find your past application and review it with you, yes. What is the approximate percentage of projects submitted that are approved? So something like 20-something% are usually awarded funding. And that's the end of the question list. Does anyone have another they want to add? And if not, we're happy you were able to participate. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And goodbye.